Auf jeden Fall setzt die Debatte zu der Frage, wer ordnet die Welt, einen sehr interessanten Schlussakkord, der gut passt zu dem gestrigen Auftakt. Und zum Abschluss des diesjährigen Körber History Forums wollen wir also fragen, was genau ist der Kit von Ordnungsmodellen? Wann genau haben wir eigentlich begonnen, global zu denken? Und welche Lehren können wir aus dem Untergang der imperialen Ordnung im 20. Jahrhundert ziehen? Und während ich weiterspreche, kommen einfach schon unsere nächsten Sprecher hier auf die Bühne. Das ist ganz wunderbar, wie das hier läuft. Ja, Sie bekommen auch noch einen Stuhl, genau. Also wir wollen fragen, welche Lehren können wir aus der Geschichte imperialer Ordnung ziehen und was sagt uns das eigentlich heute und wie wird heutzutage eigentlich Macht definiert und ausgeübt? Ich freue mich auf ein spannendes Gespräch mit kompetenten Experten und Gesprächspartnern. Bitte begrüßen Sie mit mir sehr herzlich Karen Donfried, die Präsidentin des German Marshall Fund of the United States. Dann Christoph Heusgen, wir freuen uns sehr, dass Sie hier sind, außen- und sicherheitspolitischer Berater der Bundeskanzlerin im Bundeskanzleramt und in Kürze, wenn ich das richtig verstanden habe, deutscher Botschafter bei den Vereinten Nationen. Adam Roberts, Professor Emeritus für internationale Beziehungen am Balliol College in Oxford und last but not least Sylke Tempel, Moderatorin.
Und Patrick?
Ja, den habe ich, weil er mir so vertraut ist, einfach gleich übersehen. Das tut mir sehr leid, da wäre ich noch zu gekommen. Ich komme jetzt zuerst zur Moderatorin, um den Faden beizubehalten. Sylke Tempel, Chefredakteurin der Zeitschrift Internationale Politik und des Berlin Policy Journal, und Patrick Cohrs, der hauptamtlich eigentlich an der Universität Yale lehrt und arbeitet und derzeit Senior Associated Fellow ist an der Central European University in Budapest und da derzeit auch sehr interessante Entwicklungen miterlebt. Allerdings heute, Herr Cohrs, sind Sie hier wegen Ihrer wissenschaftlichen Expertise zu der Entwicklung von Ordnung im späten 19. und frühen 20. Jahrhundert. So, jetzt übergebe ich an das Podium und freue mich auf einen guten Abschluss des Körber History Forum. Dankeschön.
Vielen Dank. We just used the time now to find a consensus, and the consensus was that we'd all speak English on this panel, because this is the one language that we all have in common, and it makes it a lot easier because we don't have to put in the ear plug and then put it out again. So I guess that's all right with you. This, of course, is the Körber History Forum, and we all know that history is a very willful, very strong-willed lady that sometimes pretends to be some kind of an oracle that can tell you what we could learn from her, but yet sometimes she puts her cards pretty close to her chest, and we have difficulties discovering what exactly we can extrapolate from history. Yeah, the historians are already giggling. I hope that probably this is your lifelong experience with dealing with this strong-willed lady. Still, what we would try to do is to really go into the long lines and do the big idea thing I was about to say, and to understand, when we are asking who regulates the world, to understand what has regulated the world for time, what we can learn from it. And so far we know that it's basically been empires, and I would like to ask you, Mr. Adams, first, and then also Patrick Cohrs. Empires has proven to be pretty long-lived. The Roman Empire lived on for a couple of hundred years. The Byzantine Empire made it up to 1400 years. Very often we forget that there was a Persian Empire that was very long-lived. And I would like to ask, a political order that lasted for such a long time, that was so decisive for whole regions, what was the glue really that kept them together? What is it? Is it ideas? Is it power? Is it the one hegemon?
Well, empires, we will agree, don't last forever.
Obviously not.
And I remember a wonderful book published in France in, I think, 1988, called Tout empire périra, by a historian, arguing that all empires come to an end. And it was certainly a well-timed publication, because unlike some other writers about empire, the author did foresee that the Soviet empire was in deep trouble and would come to an end. So we're still left with the question, yes, it is true that many empires have lasted as long or longer than states. And if one can draw a simple distinction between the two, and at the borders, it's not a simple distinction. And it seems to me that if you think of the state as a national ethnic entity, as a particular nation state and a particular contiguous bit of territory, yes, they don't last forever, not least because populations themselves change their identities, their religions, and so on. On the other hand, if you think of empires as ideological entities, some of them do carry conviction as well as strength, physical strength, and that mixture is quite powerful and continues to be relevant in the modern world. We shouldn't fool ourselves that we are completely at the end of the imperial era. The kind of glues that held empires together still exist in some cases. And let me just, one obvious example is China, which is has a number of different ethnic groups within it and so on.
But does China think of itself as an empire, really? Still?
No, because it's land contiguous. And there is a very widespread notion that things only count as empires when there's salt water between the mother country and the empire.
Well, perhaps then we have to define a bit more, because the interesting thing about empires is that they glue together different ethnic, sometimes religious entities. Think of the Ottoman Empire. And for us, searching for 1.5 days here at this historical forum about a new order. The question is, what is it that puts these things in order? What is it, Patrick Cohrs, that really glues these different entities together, that makes them believe that they belong, or perhaps makes them lose their belief of belonging?
I think the first thing we have to start with is not to overemphasize the relevance of empire in a way, if we want to really draw lessons here. And I think, and especially to ask ourselves, is glue really the metaphor we are looking for? Are these forms of rule? To begin with, it's a German translation of the title, "Who regulates the world?" Who rules the world would be the English way of
or who
looking
provides
at
some order that some other countries or some other entities can adhere to.
So I would say historically what we have to see with different imperial systems, there are some common elements, but there's a very distinct element, of course, of the use of force and coercion in enlarging an empire and creating a kind of central authority that can back up the kind of system for which it stands. There can be an ideological element, but there can also be, if one looks at it in the longue durée, the relative absence of factors of cohesion that we assume for a modern nation state, citizenship and other attributes. So you can have structures that are more like imperial systems that are relatively flexible. They provide some incentives, they provide force. But I think it's very important then to realize, and it's maybe banal, that what we look at is how the empire situates itself within itself in this imperial space. It's a very different question how it deals with the rest of the known world that it does not cover. And I think here, these are the kinds of questions, if we go towards modern history, which become very interesting, because here we have empires that are then also required to act as hegemons, playing a different role. We might talk about the British Empire. And that gets us, I think, more on a track towards the modern problems of actually keeping up a kind of empire structure. I think the word empire is very much overrated. You can always publish books with suggesting new forms of empire. I think this can be very misleading.
And let's talk about order, and let's ask a perhaps more interesting question again to you. When did we really start? Because you just mentioned that empires were thinking of themselves in, being in the part of the known world. Who cares what's in the world that's not known to them or didn't play any role? But when did we start to think in global terminology? Because in our discussions here, we were constantly talking about a global order, some kind of an architecture that provides us with the means to sort out things, to sort out differences, to find a consensus, something that basically makes us deal with one another in a preferably civilized way. So when did the unknown become the known? When did is there a culmination point where we could say, this is when we started to think globally?
I would argue it's very hard to find such a point, and I think one would have to distinguish between human imagination and ideas of the world and what should order the world, ideas of more universal rules, universal patterns, and the actuality of something like a world order. And I would even go so far as to say that for something that even remotely meets the ideas of a global order, commonly somewhat accepted, not just coerced rules and understandings of how the whole world should be governed, even the 19th century does not offer us with many models, because at that point you have a world often called 19th century world order, but it's extremely hierarchical. It's extremely separated by spheres of civilizational and other forms of privilege. It's extremely hierarchical in many other ways. And it's only at the beginning of the 20th century, I would say, in this great crisis moment after the Great War, that we have both the concept of a new world order and the profound difficulties of actually working out what this means at an age of self-determination, giving equal rights to all the different parties in the world. This is something Enlightenment thinkers had thought about. This is something Greek historians a long time had thought about for the Mediterranean world. But on a global scale, I would go all the way towards 1916 and the following years for this culmination point.
Which might have to do with the fact that after World War I, 5 big political realms ended. The Ottoman Empire, the German Empire, the Austrian, the Habsburg Empire, so the Russian Empire, that was all gone. But what I would like to ask, when we say empire is perhaps not the kind of point that we have to deal with, and when it's about a force and coercion, Karen, there was something introduced after 1945 by the United States that was of totally different character. And it was not so much about a hegemon anymore. Even the United States was the most powerful element in this new architecture. It was wasn't it really about the force of ideas? The idea that we had to have a certain political order in order to function together. Wasn't it that for the first time a hegemon did not really exercise its power through force and coercion, but through a kind of an offer? So is it wrong to count the American or the US into the realm of empire then?
Well, it's interesting because we don't often talk about the American empire. And I was struck, I unfortunately wasn't there last night, but what was talked about last night was the end of the West. And so the concept that we use is the West, and it's very interesting because it gets at what you're talking about, which is this period of history that the US has been a dominant feature of has been marked by consensus. And it's been a combination of power and ideas. And when we think back to that period in 1945, this year we're marking the 70th anniversary of the Marshall Plan. But of course, that period of history wasn't just marked by Marshall's speech, which set out the foundation of this liberal international order based on democratic systems of governance, free market economies, rights of the individual, rule of law. That's the ideas part of the equation that had an appeal far beyond the US. But we have to remember the power part of that equation too. You have to remember Churchill's Iron Curtain speech that took place. You have to remember the Truman Doctrine, which preceded the Marshall Plan. And it's such an interesting period because you have a British Empire in decline. And why did we enunciate the Truman Doctrine? Because the UK could not play that role in Greece and Turkey anymore. And there was a threat perceived by communism that the US, to protect its own interests, stepped into. And we remember in that period of history, we had the Morgenthau Plan that was being bandied about as well. So the fact that you saw the US in that post-war period realized that it was in its own self-interest to spend 12% of the US budget in 1949 to help Europe recover economically. I mean, it is a fascinating example that really captures this mix of power and ideas.
What I found really striking, through these discussions that we've followed since yesterday evening was how difficult it seems to be for us to clearly define what the West is, because we seem to constantly mix up geography with ideas. So what you've just been describing is basically, and that would answer the question that was put to you, Fyodor, in the previous panel, tell me what Europe is before I can answer you whether we belong to Europe. Then the question would be easily answered. It is, you belong to the West if your political order is basically along the lines of separation of power, separation of religion and state, rule of law, independent judiciary, a free press, and we come to this later because why I'm naming all these elements. Doesn't that answer pretty much the question about what is it that holds the West together? It's sharing these elements of a political order with different, not elements, but different kind of variations. You can be a monarchy like the United Kingdom. You can be a very executive power like France or the United States. You can be pretty much a consensus power like Germany, but these elements have to be there if you want to really belong to the West.
Well, it's so interesting. I think the geography is because of that post-war period of history, because it did begin with the US and its European allies. But it grew from there. So of course it also includes Japan and Australia, and so it's larger than that geography, but you're right, it captures that set of shared values. And what's so interesting right now is if you think about the foundation, the geography, it was the US believing that a strong relationship with Europe was in our interest, economically, politically, and in security terms. And it was also where you see the US supporting European cooperation. Let's remember, the Marshall Plan wasn't the US saying, here's what you should do. The US said to the Europeans that participated, you tell us what you need, and you tell us how to divide the money. We didn't divide the money. It was those 16 participating countries that made those decisions. And today, there seems to be a US president who doesn't share those foundational ideas. And that's what's so fascinating about this moment, where the leading power in the system, the leading power that created that order, is it making a decision to retreat from it?
Ask Christoph about this.
And then we should go back to our historians to see if you've ever seen that in history.
Oh, we'll definitely do this, but let's go to the practitioner of foreign policy for a moment and ask you, because you had quite a few encounters with the new administration. And of course, we want to know all the details about your backroom conversations, etc., because we are among us here. But the really important question, of course, is we wouldn't be talking about who regulates the world or who wer ordnet die Welt, which is a slightly better formulation than regulation. If we were confronted with a US administration that seems to undermine the very elements that we were talking about, that is now under investigation because of obstruction of justice in the first 5 months of him taking office, who doesn't seem to pay much respect to a free media, or even has declared media as the enemy of the people, which is very unusual for the president of a democratic country, to say the least, who seems to not quite understand the system of checks and balances. So, as a representative of the country, there was, where there was one strategic goal to sort of build it into the new architecture in order to help its democratic transformation. How does one deal with that?
Well, I think that first I want to echo absolutely what Karen said before. What the West, what post-war transatlantic relations were built on was the rule of law, democracy, human rights, freedom of press, etc. And I don't see any reason why we shouldn't stay course. So I think the principles that Europe actually, interesting that nobody mentioned Europe, the European Union, which in your definition could also be seen as a kind of empire. One doesn't use this word.
We'll come to
anymore.
that.
Okay, I thought so. But why shouldn't we? I don't see any reason why we don't insist on saying that what Europe taking into account its history, what Europe has, and all Europeans have agreed upon, that this is the way we want to follow, that for this US administration now to change tack, why we shouldn't pursue our growth and try with a lot of strategic patience, and you need more strategic patience than we thought at the beginning probably, but why we shouldn't continue on this course and try to convince also the new administration that what the United States stood for, what we learned from the US in post-war, post-Second War history, that this isn't, that this still remains valued.
When we keep to the definition that we need order in order to sort things out that are of relevance, or sometimes even of existential relevance to many, many countries, if not all countries, I would identify a few fields. One would be the realm of security, which definitely targets at the core of the transatlantic alliance, NATO, etc., etc. The second would be one element that we also thought was beneficial to all of us, and that is free trade, in a way that doesn't leave too many people behind, because we've seen that a really rapid globalization can upset quite a lot of people and cause legitimate grievances. And if we identify a third field, just roughly, like climate and climate change and tackling that, where would you see, could you work and should you work with this administration? Or do you have to sometimes work around it in order to keep what we need to be kept?
Well, these are all key questions, and we have to continue to work with the US administration on these topics. To start with security, I mean, you all know the arguments. We decided as the alliance after the Russian aggression against Ukraine to commit 2%, and this was under the Obama administration. We'll do that. We continue in this way. At the same time, now we have the European Union in its March European Council, when they're celebrating 60 years of the European Union, said that they want to have a stronger European defense complementing the alliance, and I think that we have to continue to do this. There is no working around this. This is our security. This is this is essential. On trade, I mean, this country, Europe, the transatlantic relations have actually flourished on free trade, and we have built free trade agreements worldwide, and the Americans were champions. We try to be champions, and we think we have to continue on this tack. And
are you surprised a bit that the Chinese come in and are being champions of free trade? Actually, the one country where we never thought would be a champion of free trade?
Well, they do fantastic PR. Yes, the Davos speech was impressive. But you know,
he's such a diplomat. The Davos speech was impressive.
No, but you can remind the Chinese that it's not that easy to own a 100% company in the country. So there is still a lot for the Chinese to catch up. We had on free trade, what I wanted to say with regard to trade and U.S. relationship, there is some movement now. We had at the G7 that for the first time Trump agreed to say something negative about protectionism. I mean, for everybody in the room here, probably this is natural that you do that, but for the administration, this was something positive. And the new, I think the new trade secretary said that, well, maybe there's reason to pursue TTIP negotiations. So we are making some headway. On climate, there I must say this is
again, China seems to be the champion on climate.
Well, it's good. I mean, they have to catch up a lot. They do it also for their. You have been in Beijing and
they do it very much for their own sake, which is okay.
Exactly.
If you can do something that's globally good, and if it's for keeping your regime, fine. If it's good for the global good.
Yeah. So why not? And I think there again, there is no way that I think the governments that signed the Paris Agreement will agree to renegotiate. We'll continue on this tack, and we'll see with pleasure that a number of, Karen can say more on that, US states and cities will pursue the Paris Agreement. So we'll continue on the way that the global community has decided that this is the right way forward, and we'll continue that way.
So persuasion and diversification would be, at the same time, would be basically the key words. I would like to take up Karen's question and throw it at you as historians. Have you ever seen a situation where, let's call it a power, has created a political order, at least for some part of the world during the Cold War, which was also still very convincing after the second imperial power had ceased to exist in this form, basically was undermining its own fundament in such a way, in a situation where, if you look at the global, if we look globally again, we are in a situation where we don't really see ideological challenges, or we don't see a real competition of ideas. Because if we look who are the competitors, it's China trying to sort of tell us that you can have capitalism without democracy. It's Russia trying to tell us that, you know, kind of a mixture of conservative revolution combined with some spiritual power, bringing in from, you know, a very close to state religion like the Russian Orthodox Church, combined with, you know, some elements of mafia state, if I may say so, plus political Islam, which is really not very attractive to most people, especially non-Muslims, where we don't really have these kind of competitors in the field of ideas. And still we have a situation where we ourselves seem to undermine ourselves, and therefore a specific order. Is there any historical parallel to this that you could think of?
There are not many. I mean, the situation we now face is utterly extraordinary. One can draw some comparisons between Kaiser Wilhelm and Donald Trump, but not on that particular matter of, as it were, willfully throwing away your main assets.
We always like to be reminded of Kaiser Wilhelm. Yeah.
I mean, one can look at the case of the United Kingdom at the moment as an interesting case of a country, in some ways, committing an act of self-harm. And the evidence for that is just beginning to come in. Awareness of its extraordinary knock-on effects in British politics, in the question of the Irish border. The economic situation now is suddenly looking worse, and so on. So one can see there, by a process that's very different from the one in the United States, but still involves undermining the main economic foundations on which we've been working for a generation. There is an element of self-harm in that. And I have to say about that I think I admire the way in which Germany, among others, who has every reason to be exasperated with the British, has said that it believes the door should be kept open, that if Britain changes its mind in a reasonably near future.
I have to admit, we have a hard time reading what Great Britain really wants these days.
So do we. It's
that was my
extremely difficult to divine. And I mean, just on that subject, there's a lingering resentment among many, and I include myself, in the sense that the referendum was done in a constitutionally bizarre way, but B, was won by lies. I mean, I've kept all the referendum literature I received, which told us that Turkey was in process of joining the European Union, and there would be 80 million people providing untold millions of refugees and would-be migrants.
I know, I was pretty surprised when I was asked this question during a Königswinter conference, you know, when Turkey will join the European Union and why we would let 80 million Turks in, and go like, what?
Quite.
Yeah.
And equally, of course, in that literature of the referendum very clear indications that we could be like Switzerland or Norway.
I thought that this role was reserved for Germany for a long while. I wanted to be a big Switzerland.
But it's out for us. I do think that, that there was a big problem in the way all of that was done. And now, after the referendum, we're stuck because it is an absolutely basic principle of democracy, for better or for worse, that you're willing to accept the results.
Absolutely. Patrick.
To just come back to your question of examples in history, I think the first thing any historian would say is be aware of the deceptive quality of false analogies. So I think it's very rare actually to find a similar example. But if we stick with Britain for a moment, I think the 19th century still provides us with something to think about. If you think about Britain as, by far the most sort of superior power, building a world system, being a world empire, but also for a long time being a hegemon in what was known as the European concert, taking responsibility, building a kind of system of European international law that they were committed to maintaining in the early parts of the 19th century, and how at some point the idea grew out of a sense of superiority that one doesn't need to enter into all these complicated commitments. And this has sometimes been sort of framed under the heading of splendid isolation. It wasn't so splendid, and there was a price to be paid, because when the world situation changed and imperial competition and other competition were putting Britain on the British Empire on a defensive system, the only remedy was to form alliances. This gets us into the prehistory of the First World War. But this is something that thinkers in the early 20th century, especially also American thinkers, were looking at when thinking about how they could find ways to legitimize, also domestically, long-term commitments in the international system. And I think this is one of the core problems we would have to look at in a modern society. Apart from very imminent security threats, how do you actually justify to your own population a long-term investment in stabilizing a global order? And I think that's still a very relevant question now.
That is the question I would like to sort of throw back at you and then open to the audience, because I'm sure that you have tons of questions. The question is that perhaps we should look at a new model that we've seen emerging after Second World War, which provided us the kind of cohesion, because also there was an external threat that we had to deal with. But here's a model, and it's amazing whenever I'm at workshops run by companies who think about their structures within the companies. There's one thing that they keep on telling you in the digital age is you have to keep people on board. You have to legitimize your role as the boss. You have to see that you're much more into teamwork and consensus. You have to have participation. Now, the question is, the old model of a hegemon providing you with certain goods that everybody else can accept or would want, the kind of combination of force and coercion doesn't seem to work anymore. It has to be kind of a consensus 2.0, or perhaps even consensus 4.0. And in this regard, isn't the EU an example where you cannot have this one hegemon, where you have to have a consensus, where you have to have the smaller ones on board agreeing to it, where you have to have countries who basically put in ideas and resources because they're stronger ones, but do not feel that they have to call the shots at the end? Is this the new model of an order that we could offer? Christoph, we start with you.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is what this continent had thrived on during the last 60 years. And I continue to believe that a rules-based order, and this is what the European Union is, that is the conclusion that Europe drew after the First and Second World War, that it's now ruled by law and not ruled by force. And so this, I think this is an enormous adventure, enormous success. But one of the things you mentioned before about what you said about the digital time companies, whatever, you have to be close to your followers. You have to be close
participation.
to participation. And this is something that maybe we have lost a bit over time, that Brussels may have been a bit too far away from the ordinary citizens, and governments have too long, when something went wrong, have said, well, it's Brussels that is guilty. And I think there is a mistake or two mistakes that have been committed and which we have to get right. But basically, I think this is also the way for the future. And I think right now, when you see what happened in the US, what happened in Britain, maybe Macron helps, but I have the impression, maybe it's biased, but my impression is there is kind of a European renaissance, that people believe after all, well, you know, what we have there, seeing what is happening all around us, maybe that's not the worst thing, and this is something worth to preserve, and we have to concentrate more on.
To put it in Shakespearean terms, it seems that the winter of our discontent is over, at least for the time being. Even we haven't really tackled the roots of what has led to such discontent. And it seems to me, and here again the question to the historian in thinking in long lines, isn't it also very much a periphery center problem? And isn't it also a bit of a problem about a kind of greater abstraction? You know, Brussels is very abstract very often, and people have to feel what's close to them and how the EU positively influences their life. Because if they don't notice any of that, it's easy to be discontent. I know, I mean, Britain choose to be rather on the periphery than in the center of the European Union, but still the question to the historian, how do we solve the periphery center problem?
It's inherently extremely difficult to solve within the European Union for the reason that you mentioned, that if there has to be anything, to achieve anything requires the agreement of so very many countries, obviously, there tend to be a lot of very slow and difficult negotiating processes, and it may be that agreements aren't always reached on the things that are most urgently call for agreement. But I do think we can take some encouragement from the way things have gone. What you describe as a European Renaissance may partly be the power of Britain's negative example, when people can see the troubles we're about to get into and the difficulty, which is going to be extremely difficult, of the negotiations that are coming up. That seems to be giving pause to many European publics and making them think that it's better to make decisions within the European Union rather than outside it. And that's an illustration of a larger point one could make about the global liberal order. For all its numerous faults, and I'm rather a critic of the liberal idea that the story of the world is the story of the expansion of liberalism. Much as I think liberal politics are a very good thing, to view that history in that light risks simplifying the explanations as to why some countries have authoritarian governments, and risks taking us down a path of liberal interventionism. And I believe that the failure of successive liberal interventions helps to explain everything, including the referendum result in the UK and Trump in America. It's that sense that governments had not had magic, had not achieved great things in their overseas interventions that contributed to what happened.
Just to jump in on this point, I think that's part of it, but I also think that there is a very deep sense of grievance that a lot of Americans who voted for Donald Trump felt, which is that their system of governance was not delivering for them. Yeah. And you look at income inequality, I mean, you look at real factors that are at play in the US, this crisis of identity that was there as well, fed by migration. There are lots of issues that I think governments do need to deal with. And, you know, I want to be clear that I'm not predicting a post-American world here. I would argue that what we're experiencing in the US is a cyclical event, not a structural event. And when we think about how the European Union will develop, I would say it's very much in the interest of the US if the EU does become stronger. Because what we haven't talked so much about is that there is a larger global shift of power going on. And in fact, what Americans and Europeans, what the West has worked toward for the past 7 decades has been lifting hundreds of millions of Chinese and others out of poverty. This is something we have been proud of. And the challenge is, can we in fact have China be a responsible stakeholder in this rules-based order? And it seems to me that we are best placed to do that if we work well together and lift up things like a Trans-Pacific Partnership or TTIP, because this is showing that a rules-based, in that case, trading system leads to greater prosperity, and then hopefully you're setting an example that China wants to be a part of. That's not what we've been doing. And so I think that we have to put it in that larger frame of a global shift of power. And why is it in the interest of the US and its European partners to continue to work together in maintaining that order?
Karen, when we look at it, wasn't one factor that contributed to the kind of, let's call it the shakiness of our post-World War American-led order, also that we so much believed in something that I would now call the convergence era. That we thought that, when there's a stronger middle class and when there's more wealth, I mean, they basically become like us, in the sense of they will build more of a political order similar to ours with all the elements. And guess what? This didn't happen because identity plays such a role. And for a while we were thinking that our identity plays a role there. We cannot sort of force our political system on them, until we finally realized in Brexit, in the strength of the Front National for a long time, and they're not gone by any means, or in the election of Donald Trump, that this not becoming like us plays a role in our very societies. Now the question will be, how can we fill or refill this kind of the power of the idea into, or reinstill it into our own societies? How can we, if we want to keep up a rules-based political order, then my feeling from this conversation also is, and from other conversations, is that we have to rediscover our faith into the strengths of the ideas that we have, that originated with the democratic revolutions, sorry France, in Great Britain and the United States, with the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers, etc., etc. And then we have to understand our own system a lot better.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I think that's right, but I think there's another massive question if we look at it from a global perspective. And
well, that's a panel of massive questions, as we figured, yeah.
It's always, I mean, it comes back to words and deeds and double standards, and the question how persuasive have Western powers been in not just enunciating these rules, but also living up to them on a global scale. And of course, the 20th century, if you go through it, and I won't abuse our time, you have multiple ways in which hierarchically top powers have used civilizational, cultural, all kinds of arguments of this kind to build up hierarchies, but to call it a road towards greater equality. And this is the trend that is especially strong in liberal imperialist thought, especially in Britain and the United States, but elsewhere as well. And I think this is a temptation that is as old as the Western so-called world. You can see it in Athens' relations with its smaller city-states and how Athens became an empire, invoking for itself the kind of being the only true democracy. So for me, apart from doing soul-searching about our own identity, we have to just face up to the fact that we haven't been very good and very persuasive at playing by our own rules.
Isn't that a dilemma that we always face, that is inherent in the system? Because the thing about democracy is that it's built on a very simple and, to me, really, really appealing idea, and that is it's built on imperfection. It's built on the idea that mankind is prone to error and that we have to correct it. And actually, democracy is the only order that gives us the opportunity to correct mistakes, at least most of them. And we're constantly making mistakes, also big-time mistakes like, for example, the Iraq War, which is not a political system, but it happened in the attempt to sort of spread democracy through military means and not through the power of conviction. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that's not very fashionable, but aren't we sometimes too harsh about ourselves by putting a standard of perfection to ourselves? Well, we are as imperfect as everybody else.
brief answer, not perfection, but learning, actual real learning, and drawing lessons, and not just having the talk of drawing lessons, but not really changing action. Because that's noted, you know, it's, people are not stupid.
Oh, definitely not. Join us in this conversation. I see one hand going up right here, and we have, of course, microphones, and we've got lots of hands up. Let's start here, and it would be great if you'd briefly introduce yourself, and if this was a brief question.
Yes, my name, does it work?
Yeah.
My name is Hans-Christian Jasch. I'm heading the Wannsee Memorial, so I basically deal with memory and genocide. And Herfried Münkler, teaching here at Humboldt University, just a block away from here, argued in his book Empires that there's always one element of an empire as a uniting idea. And this is something which I would like to bring back into the debate, because even negative ideas, even the Nazi empire had ideas which were seeking to integrate people around racism, around anti-Semitism, around territorial expansion. But you had the Roman Empire with the Roman citizenship, you had the Attical Sea Federation with Athens at the center. And if we are looking at the end of the West, isn't the question whether maybe the West lost its appeal? We were speaking about double standards. The pictures.
Can we just ask this question? Did the West lose its appeal?
This would be the question I was asking, but if we look at the pictures from Abu Ghraib, or if we look at Guantanamo, if we look at the issue of double standards, hasn't this sort of corrupted the very central ideas of what made the West so appealing?
Do you want this
this
question answered by somebody specifically, or do you want me to throw it just as one of the historians?
I would throw it to the panel.
No. Well, let's answer. Would you like to answer this question? Has the West lost its appeal?
So how do you answer that question? One way to answer it is to ask, are there other countries and powers that are interested in becoming part of that community? And the interesting thing is that there are. And I think that the standard we should hold ourselves to is not that we don't make mistakes, because we are human. But the question is, how do you manage those mistakes? And I would say the way the US dealt with Abu Ghraib, I would stand by that. I would in no way stand by what happened there, but the way we came to terms with that part of our own history. And I think that the thing about democracy is you do have checks and balances in a system. And I think it's very powerful when you talk about rule of law that, you know, democratic governance can lose in their own courts. Richard Nixon was impeached in the United States, or the US is part of creating a WTO where it can lose in those. So I think it's the structure that gives people the best shot at finding justice. And what we know is that that arc of finding justice can often be quite a long one.
Is it also true then that we are much more vulnerable to that kind of criticism, because people rightfully say, here you are, and you're preaching us values and standards, and then look at you, something like Abu Ghraib should never have happened?
Absolutely. I think that it's a part of the process of, as it were, moral difficulty that the West has been in for 2 decades now. There were various aspects of the war on terror that did lead to this discrediting, these accusations of hypocrisy and double standards with which we live. And I think in answer to, as it were, the more general part of the question we've just been asked, there are a number of things that are disquieting about the whole liberal tradition that do need rethinking now we're in these crises. And just to give 2 examples, there's more of an interventionist and colonial side to the tradition of liberal international thought than we would feel comfortable with today. Mm-hmm. John Locke had shares in a slave trading company and was involved in writing pro-slavery provisions into the Constitution of Carolina. We've got Jeremy Bentham, who actually tried to persuade the United States government to launch an intervention into Tripoli because he didn't like the ruler there. There is a continuous thread, and a very worrying one, of interventionism there. And on the basis of the sobering experience, not just of the recent cases, but of Vietnam as well, we have to learn the limits of intervention, and I think we are learning them, which doesn't mean you should never intervene. That wouldn't be my conclusion, but that you really need to understand the culture, the politics of a country before you rush into it. And equally, one could make the same conclusion about free trade and globalization. Adam Smith warned repeatedly in The Wealth of Nations that you should not remove tariffs suddenly, that to do so would be to throw people out of work, to cause enormous disruption. There were dangers in it. Approach it slowly. That was one of the more influential parts of Enlightenment thinking in a liberal direction. But he was right in that.
I have to admit, as a typical product of the Star Trek generation, I would very much sometimes like to beam Adam Smith into our time and to see what he would have to say about the rapid developments in a digital, globalized world, and whether he could warn about not to be too rash about it, because sometimes we don't have a choice. We're pushed into this rash developments. Christoph, you wanted to answer to this as well.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in there and follow what Karen said. Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo were terrible cases, or things where we discredited our Western values. But it's very interesting to see, and we have the mechanisms to repair this. But what is interesting is that these cases are very much welcomed, if I say, by countries that are very much afraid of actually having to take on board what many of their citizens want, that is freedom of expression, democracy, and free media. And they then, when we tell them, well, we think that these are universal values and you should implement them, this point here. But you see what you have done left and right, and they. So this is the problem, that even small mistakes in our countries have enormous repercussions because they are misused. And you probably talked during the day also about all the hybrid warfare that is done, is used by others. So we have to be double careful in doing this. Now, on this intervention, and this is an interesting point that we are always discussing, we believe that we want to have an international rules-based order. The problem is that while in the European Union we pretty much have that, in international law in general, we have not made as much headway as we wanted to. There are many cases where we have not been able to set up a rule. Today, when we talk about Iraq, when we talk about Ukraine, when we talk about Kosovo, some say, well, this is all the same, and the Americans violate international law in Kosovo, so we violate international law in Ukraine, it's all the same. So this is one problem. I think we need to, and Kofi Annan at the time of Kosovo tried to develop international law further and have these kind of humanitarian interventions in situations like in Kosovo, but didn't achieve this, because there are, of course, vast differences between an intervention like Kosovo, where Serbs and others had forced the whole population out of the country. There has been efforts day and day to get a Security Council resolution. The Russians blocked it. Something totally different from an intervention from an invasion in Ukraine, where there was no question whatsoever, was never raised in the UN Security Council. So what I wanted to say is that no, I think that also in other countries, for our rules-based order, this is what I think we should continue to strive for. I think that Russia, China, other countries, they are very much afraid of this. And I think this should be an encouragement to continue to work for the implementation of these universal values. And I think we don't need to be defensive. We have to see that we commit mistakes, and we have, maybe you said this is not, this is, what did you say, Karen? What you have, goes in cycles. This is
cyclical rather than structural.
So yeah. You're right. And so I think we shouldn't be, we Europeans and Germans tend to be always very pessimistic. I think there is no reason for this.
that would actually be a great final words. But let's keep it in mind, because I would like to take 2 more questions in there if they're really short and snappy. But please keep this in mind for the idea of what we're talking about order, that, universal values is still something, is a still very powerful idea, something to be pursued, from what I understand. It's something that we need if we really want to have a rules-based order, and that's exactly what we talk about. Please.
Maria Fusaro, University of Exeter. I'll try to be short and snappy and try to go back to the point that was just mentioned a few times. But first, I'd just like to thank the panel for a very bold and nuanced discussion. We talked about free trade, and the discussion was bold and nuanced in terms of political action, political authority, and values. But the big elephant in the room, I suppose, is how to regulate the economy, transnational economic, and that has got quite a lot more than just free trade, which, by the way, is highly regulated in itself. So there's more to be said in that, and I would like to simply throw this to the panel and see some comments about it. Thank you.
Since this is a big question, I'd like to give them some time to think about, and we take the second question here, and then we decide who's going to take this question.
Yes, hello, Michaela Küfner from Deutsche Welle. I have a question for Professor Roberts. As a historian, could you give us a first draft of history on what you feel is Germany's responsibility in stabilizing this global order that's so under siege right now? And then I would like Mr. Heusgen, since you're here, to tell us whether you agree with that.
Well, to give him enough time, I would say dinner starts at 10 p.m. Professor Roberts, if you want to take this question first, then we still have a bit of time to talk about regulating globalization and who is brave enough to take this question. Professor Roberts, please, go ahead.
Well, I tend, although I teach international relations, I tend to be nervous about global generalization. And it's the problem with our subject. Indeed, I can't resist mentioning, since this is the Körber Forum, that there was some years ago a course laid on at the University of Charlottesville in America, which has my absolute favorite title. It was called Remedial History for International Relations Specialists. And there's a great deal that goes on in terms of grand historical generalization, including, sadly, sad to say, in the subject I teach. To me, it would be enough if Germany could perform effectively its role in stabilizing Europe, and indeed, in particular, the Eurozone. That's in itself a huge task. And as regards a contribution to global stabilization, I think liberal democracies underestimate, at their peril, the importance of ensuring that they themselves remain cohesive and well run. That's the most important single contribution that democracies can make to a global picture. And when democracies get over ambitious ideas, they sometimes, not always, but sometimes run into trouble. And so I would incline to I'm afraid, a distressingly cautious answer to that. Having said that, there are elements of the overall international legal system of which we need to demonstrate the continuing relevance and continuing capacity to adapt. And I think the Guantanamo question we were asked is a classic case where there are rules which did govern the whole question of treatment of detainees. And we have had a learning process in the UK, much like the one you described in the United States, where we addressed that. The case was the Bahamusa case. The inquiry, a judge-led inquiry, produced an extremely good expose of the limits of the faults of the existing systems of instruction and training in the UK Army and made some extremely practical proposals for change. I've got an interest in it because I gave evidence to it. But I think in terms of the larger law-based system, rather than use grandiose language, such as our own Foreign Office has tended to use, of supporting the international rule of law overall, we should take care to look at the detail of how we actually do things. And that would apply to Germany as much as it does to the UK.
Thanks. Christoph.
Well, thanks very much for this response. And I think this is now the moment to pay tribute to Helmut Kohl, who would actually subscribe to what you said. You know, we have to run our country in a way that you know, he worked and achieved reunification, and I think to run a country well is very important. And then to work for Europe and have Europe run the Eurozone or the development of Euro. We said earlier that Europe is the one thing I think we should, at least from my perspective, is the one thing we have to pursue in Europe, and it has to function. And this is in the best interest of European citizens, and also I think it's in the best interest of our neighborhood. And so I think this is what we do. We must not, as you said, we can participate in solving international crisis, but we I don't think should not, as you said, just overdo it and do more than we recently can do.
Patrick, just to tackle this question, if you allow me, I would turn it a slight bit around because it's going to a historian. Very often in Germany, we draw parallels, of course, with the 20s whenever it's getting a bit topsy-turvy or more. But isn't the real parallel that we should look at the late 19th century as the half century that really led into a first phase of greater interdependence and globalization? So where people tended to believe that economic interdependence would also lead to political interdependence, would then consequentially lead to peace and then we ran into World War I. Of course, we've been talking about this very often in 2014, sleepwalkers had said, don't even have to quote this.
Yes.
But is there anything from the 19th century, even if we say the 21st century in globalization and trade is basically the 19th on speed, is there anything that we can perhaps take away from there to say, how can we tackle an issue like this to tame a bit of what we see now, which sometimes seems to overwhelm us? Do I reflect your question in any sense kinda appropriately? Sort of. Okay.
So to attempt a very short answer, I would still have to widen the horizon toward the mid-20th century, because I think if we see the late 19th century as part of a process of profound crisis of certain beliefs that were proven wrong, of the idea that you could have this kind of economic independence leading to political order and patterns of independence that would actually prevent a major war, then of course the real learning that went on takes us to the mid-1940s, I would argue, and nowadays we see this as a period maybe also of over-regulation, but we must not forget, I think, that the very nuanced debates about that the answer to fascism, the answer to, of course, also the communist challenge was not a hyper-capitalist globalization perspective, but something that was a very far more regulated world economic system with all the problems that created. So I would say this kind of the lesson of what the crisis, especially of the 1930s, showed was the fallacy of thinking that you can have a much more self-regulating kind of world economic system. And this is a serious debate that is now, I think, still much harder because it's much harder to conceive of something like a global social market economy.
And agreements, of course, is that we feel that it's not really in our hands.
Yes. But I think that's already, if we stop even thinking in this direction and allow neoliberal and other agendas to still rule the day, then we'll never get anywhere. And this is what people in the 1920s, for example, thought in the United States. It was a period of expansion. They thought they could have their cake and eat it, and the cake was then pretty rotten in the 1930s.
That's not such a happy note. Still, I would very much like to end it here. I would like to thank my panel here that was really exquisitely answering all these questions. I would like to thank you for all your questions, and of course I would like to thank the organizers. Is there any formalities that I have to announce now? Would you like to do it?
I would like
Absolutely.
to announce the formalities, and starting by thanking the whole panel for being with us for an interesting debate about a very, very big issue. We've tackled upon some quite big issues during the last 1.5 days. And this is the end of the official part of the Körber History Forum, the second Körber History Forum, and you can continue discussing over dinner. And so the formality I would have to announce is that we now move to the restaurant Austernbank, which is you leave the building, you turn left, and it's literally next door, so it's not far away. We meet there to continue a discussion, and thank you to the audience, to our speakers, to the translators who made us understand each other, and I hope to see you hopefully back for the third Körber History Forum next year. Thank you.